Thaddeus was my first love. Our parents arranged a betrothal for us when we were kids. After we graduated from college, he mentioned wanting to pursue further studies and flew abroad that same night. I realized he was trying to escape the engagement, but I didn't complain. I believed that one day, I'd be able to wait for him. On the day I returned home, I saw him holding hands with a girl. Serafina, let's break up. Later, he stopped me downstairs, his eyes filled with anger and hurt. Serafina, how could you marry someone else? By the evening, the big screen at the airport showed that Thaddeus's flight had just landed. The driver for the Whitlock family flashed me a grin that felt a bit too eager. Serafina, don't worry. Thaddeus will be out soon. That simple reassurance eased my nerves a bit. I focused on the exit, watching as people stepped out one after another. Didn't want to seem too eager, but my heels were already lifting up without even realizing it. After quite a wait, the person finally walked in. Dressed in a tailored trench coat, headphones hanging around his neck, with neatly styled hair highlighting his prominent brow bone, he looked very serious under the bright white lights of the airport. The driver quickly stepped forward to take his luggage. His gaze turned in my direction as well. The hand unconsciously clenched into a fist in the pocket while taking steps toward him. Long time no see. The voice sounded a bit hoarse, betraying the excitement within. Just then, a woman rushed out from behind him. Her voice was clear and pleasant. Thaddeus, why didn't you wait for me? Thaddeus's features instantly softened. He gently pulled the girl aside. That look in his eyes? He's never shown me anything like that. I blinked, feeling my eyes were incredibly dry. The girl noticed me too. She was holding hands with him and smiled as she asked, "So, you're Thaddeus's fiancé from back home?" Just as stiff and boring as the rumors said. Calliope, that's not really appropriate. I saw Thaddeus frown slightly and interrupt her, looking somewhat amused and exasperated at the same time. Looks like I should thank Thaddeus for his little kindness, huh? We didn't hang around at the airport for too long. They had set up a private room for him, and everyone was waiting. When we got to the parking lot, Calliope slid into the back seat first, and then Thaddeus got in too. I stood there, feeling a bit lost about what to do. Calliope, whether on purpose or not, sidestepped Thaddeus and put her hand on his leg. Then she leaned against the half-open car window and smiled at me, saying, "Sorry, I get car sick easily. Thaddeus usually takes care of me." There was a hint of pride in her eyes. "Why don't you sit in the front seat?" she suggested. I smiled gently and replied, "It's all right, my driver is here. I'll just go by myself." The moment I said that, Calliope's expression suddenly changed for the worse. 15 minutes after she showed up, a message from her landed on my phone. The assistant, sitting in the passenger seat, glanced over at me with concern. This woman was someone Thaddeus met while studying abroad. They often worked on assignments together. I rubbed my forehead and gave a slight nod. I got it. This isn't the first time this has happened. With a marriage contract in place and the huge Whitlock family business, my parents can't cut ties with them now. That's how we ended up in this situation. Thaddeus. I gazed out the window at the city lights whizzing by and let out a long sigh. When we arrived, the party was already in full swing. Thaddeus is always the center of attention, no matter where he is. This time is no different. The only change is that the person sitting next to him is someone else. When they saw me walk in, their expressions immediately turned a bit awkward. Still, Calliope waved at me. "Fiancé, come sit here." He had that typical host vibe. Even though I paid for this private room and the drinks were mine, the flickering lights highlighted Thaddeus's handsome features as he set his crystal glass down, the liquid inside gently swaying. "Serafina, let's step outside and talk." The corridor stretched on forever. I stood in front of him while he leaned casually against the wall, idly fiddling with a lighter. The constant clicking sound was getting on my nerves, but I just waited quietly for him to speak. Just like always, acting like the perfect, obedient wife. The elders of the Whitlock family really appreciated my behavior and often praised my parents for raising me well. But that's just their preference. Thaddeus can't stand me acting like this, but his feelings don't really matter. After all, the Whitlock family doesn't need his approval. My calves started to feel tired after standing for so long. "Serafina, let's call off the engagement," he said slowly. I had a feeling about it already, but I kept my cool on the outside. "What about the elders? I'll talk to them." That's when I finally relaxed a bit. Thaddeus stopped lighting the match and stood up straight. Is everything okay? I asked cautiously. Is there a problem? Thaddeus furrowed his brow. The tension hadn't reached its peak yet, as Calliope walked in. What are you talking about? Someone's looking for you inside. They shot me a cautious glance, and I couldn't help but laugh. All right, I got it. I raised my hands in surrender and wished them a fun night. I'm buying the drinks, so go ahead and enjoy. I was using their Whitlock family card anyway. The year I graduated from college, the Whitlock family threw a small engagement party for us, just for our elders. Thaddeus didn't look happy that day at all, and later that evening, he said he wanted to study abroad. To make it up to me, the Whitlock family gave me a black card. Most of the time, I used it for Thaddeus. After all, my family gives me pocket money. Mom said that since we're not married yet, we shouldn't get too close. Picking him up tonight is actually a subtle hint agreed upon by both families. Thaddeus has always felt like he's being forced into things. But really, who isn't? I got into the car, and my assistant asked where to go. I paused for a moment and then smiled as I replied, let's head home. After the engagement, the Whitlock family set up a house for me. When Thaddeus found out, he called me from a distance just to check in. That's impressive. You actually got my mom to buy a house for you. Not wanting to back down, I shot back right away. If you don't go study abroad, she'll be getting a place for our wedding instead. He angrily hung up the phone. Every time he comes back, he never wants to come by this house to take a look. I really don't want to stay here any longer. As soon as I got home, I found my parents still awake, waiting for me in the living room. A maid brought me a cup of hot milk and set it down in front of me. I took small sips. Ever since I was little, I've had a nutritionist help me with my meals. Every detail, from my hair to my body management, has been carefully planned. Mom was wearing a silk nightgown, and I could see her frowning at me. Still drinking milk? Huh? Has she figured out every trick in the book? Feeling a bit uneasy, I calmly said, Thaddeus wants to cancel the engagement. What? Mom sprang up immediately, her gaze sharp and intense. Dad silently asked, so what are you planning to do? He waited quietly for me to say more. I slowly finished my glass of milk before I spoke. If the Whitlock family decides to call off the engagement, I'll leave the conditions up to you. If they don't back out, then it's still the same as before, I'll marry Thaddeus. Mom's expression was a bit complicated. It looked like she wanted to say something but then held back. She understood all too well those innocent first loves. A long time ago, I had a deep crush on Thaddeus. I really liked him a lot. That was the end of the talk about family. I went upstairs and back to my room, and everything was just the same, exactly as it was before I left. I took a cardboard box out of the closet, and it was filled with things that Thaddeus had given me. When I was a kid, I was scared of nightmares, so he specially got me a cuddle buddy. Later, when I struggled with my grades, he went out of his way to write me notes. There were also some postcards from around the world, with writing that looked young and just said one thing, beautiful. Everyone says Thaddeus likes me. On the day I turned 18, the elders announced my engagement to him in front of everyone. From that moment on, Thaddeus changed. He became distant and started to keep away from me. After a few rejections, I finally realized what he was thinking. He used to like me, but it didn't seem like there was enough love there. That kind of like wasn't nearly enough to make him want to marry me. So I packed everything away and never touched it again. I called the maid and asked her to throw it all out. She looked at me in surprise and said, Miss, are you sure you want to get rid of this? I nodded. It's just a bunch of junk. There's no need to keep it. Only then did she take it all away. Things disappeared at the door, and I sat there blankly on the ground. All the frustration I had bottled up for over 10 years seemed to come to an end just like that. No matter what I went through, the outcome was still the same. Early the next morning, I headed to the house that the Whitlock family had prepared for me. Since Thaddeus said he wanted to break off the engagement, I had to take care of things properly. As soon as the fingerprint unlocked, Thaddeus walked out while drying his hair. I was taken aback and asked, What are you doing here? Before Thaddeus could respond, Calliope came out of the master bedroom, wearing my nightgown. I immediately got angry, and my expression soured. Take it off. Thaddeus stood in front of her and said, "It's just a nightgown. I can buy you another one." He acted so casual, as if it didn't matter that Calliope was wearing my clothes. Her being here was no big deal either. I clenched my fists. "This is mine." Calliope tugged at her skirt, showing no sign of apology. "I knew it. Just yesterday, I told Thaddeus that his fiancée's figure was pretty lacking." Then, Thaddeus peeked over his shoulder and winked at me. "Fiancé, you really need to take better care of yourself," he seemed to suggest. Thaddeus is into girls with curves, big breasts and a nice butt. I let out a cold laugh and just stared at Thaddeus. Should she take it off herself, or should I call the driver in to help? Thaddeus's expression turned serious. "Serafina, when did you become so unreasonable?" Calliope jumped into the fray, too. "It's just a dress. Do you really think I want to wear it?" "But you wore it too." Calliope pouted and said, "Thaddeus, are you just going to let her push me around like this?" She stormed into the master bedroom, her footsteps thudding loudly on the floor. "I knew you'd side with her. I should have just stayed back home. There's nothing fun here anyway." She raised her voice from inside. "Thaddeus, aren't you going to come help me out?" It felt so natural, as if Thaddeus was the one in charge. Thaddeus threw me a glance, seeming to want to explain that Calliope grew up abroad and has a personality more like a foreigner. I was so mad I almost laughed. Just because someone's a foreigner, does that mean they can just barge into someone else's home and wear their clothes? Thaddeus couldn't help but reply, "Serafina, this is my house that I bought for you." After finishing his words, he seemed to realize he might have gone too far. He quickly covered his forehead and said to me, "Don't overthink it. I'm just letting her stay here for a while. Do you want to head home first?" My heart ached. I fought back tears, forcing myself to keep my eyes wide open, hoping to see even a hint of remorse on his face. But unfortunately, there was nothing. Thaddeus was always used to having others make sacrifices for him, and he didn't think there was anything wrong with it. It felt like no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make any waves in his heart. Calliope was still calling for him from inside. Thaddeus hesitated for a moment but eventually walked into the master bedroom. I rubbed my cold hands together, feeling a bit awkward. Luckily, I remembered why I was there, so I opened the door. 8 workers I had brought in came in. They started to methodically tidy up the place. Thaddeus stepped out, frowning. "Serafina, do you really think this is funny?" I let them be and turned to Thaddeus. "You were the one who called off the engagement yesterday, so I'm here today to get my things back. But I didn't expect to find you here with her." Thaddeus clearly didn't care about what I said. The tone grew increasingly irritable. A passerby bumped into a cardboard box nearby, causing it to fall to the ground. The crystal vase, bought for 8,000, shattered into pieces. "Remember to pay for that." Unfazed by Thaddeus's presence, walked straight into the master bedroom. Calliope was sitting on the bed, leaning back with her arms resting on it. "What's up? Ready to take me on?" she said. She looked stunning, especially with her bright eyes that sparkled like stars in the desert night sky. However, there was a hint of disdain and pride in her gaze that felt a bit unsettling. Her attitude also came off as a bit cruel. I didn't reply. Instead, I turned to the person tidying up the master bedroom and said, "Everything here is a mess. Just handle it however you want." I deliberately looked at Calliope and said, "You can sell it or toss it, whichever you prefer." Calliope stood up, clearly furious, and asked, "What do you mean by that?" I stared at her for a moment, then slapped her hard. One side of her face immediately swelled up. The staff seemed to ignore it and kept their heads down, focused on their tasks. Calliope couldn't take that insult anymore and was ready to fight back, but I grabbed her wrist. "Next time we meet, make sure to call me by my name. I'll give you the title of fiancé." The voice came from behind, and I could hear the way Thaddeus was gritting his teeth, clearly furious. "What do you think I am to you, Thaddeus? What does the Whitlock family even mean to them?" I was taken aback when I realized Thaddeus was right behind me. The look of hatred Calliope had for me vanished in an instant as she covered her face and rushed into Thaddeus's arms. Her sobs were heart-wrenching. "Thaddeus, I want to go home." Then, without realizing it, the swollen injury on the face became visible. Thaddeus got angry right away. He gently touched Calliope's cheek, but his voice was cold. "I'm sorry. I find it funny that Calliope wears my clothes and uses my stuff. Can't I fight back?" Thaddeus shot me an angry look, but you can't hit her. As she said that, she pulled a card out of her wallet. How much did you lose? I'll cover it for you. Calliope wore a sweet smile, her tone lingering. Thaddeus, you really don't have to do this. He tossed the card to the ground, right in front of my feet. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying hard to hold back the embarrassment. Why can't I get used to this? Hasn't Thaddeus been like this for a while now? Shouldn't I be used to feeling embarrassed in front of everyone, treated like some kind of gold digger? I picked up the card from the ground. Thaddeus had this calm look on his face, like he already knew all of this would happen. Even the corners of Calliope's mouth curled into a mocking smile. I grabbed the scissors nearby and sliced the card in half. Calliope immediately panicked and reached for the card, asking, "What are you doing?" I just quietly stared at Thaddeus. This was the last time I would look at him so seriously. Thaddeus, I will definitely make sure you break off the engagement. As soon as Thaddeus heard me say that, his expression turned icy. I quickly gathered my things. I guess I didn't have much to pack because I knew they never really belonged to me. Later that evening, my friend Ophelia invited me out for drinks. By the time I arrived, she was already so drunk that she could barely keep herself together, still waving the bottle of wine at me, saying tonight was the first day to celebrate my rebirth. In the afternoon, both sides posted announcements on their social media, saying that Thaddeus and I had broken off our engagement, but we agreed to stay friends and wish each other well for the future. It all sounds pretty classy, but to be honest, I didn't really care that much. What does it feel like to be single again? Her gaze was blank, so I just tugged at her. It felt just like before. That was the honest truth. Ever since the engagement, Thaddeus had been keeping his distance. Even when he couldn't, he treated me like a stranger. Many times, I had to handle unexpected situations all by myself. For instance, at the parties, everyone just shows up with their family titles. Hardly anyone makes jokes about our wedding. That's because Thaddeus isn't really a fan of it. Gradually, people stopped mentioning our relationship altogether. Now, this actually works out better for everyone. Ophelia seems a lot happier. She opened the door, and one by one, 10 tall, handsome guys walked in. I had never seen anything like this before, and I could feel my face getting a bit hot. After I covered my nose with a tissue, I finally felt a little better. "What are you up to?" Ophelia said with a smile while holding the door. "This is what enjoying life looks like. You've been keeping yourself to Thaddeus for so many years. It's about time you tried something new." I was startled and grabbed the water cup beside me, taking a big gulp. To my surprise, it was whiskey. Ophelia said with a grin, "What's the deal? Thaddeus can play both sides. Why can't you?" 10 guys were staring at me, their faces all flushed. I had to come up with an excuse to step outside for some fresh air, so I hurried out. Ophelia laughed at me from behind, saying something like, "You better get moving before Thaddeus's kids are running all over the place and you haven't even made a move." Maybe it was the drinks getting to me, but I suddenly felt a strange rush of boldness. I had barely taken 2 steps when I bumped into a guy around the corner. He was wearing a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up halfway, showing off his strong arms. The top button was done up tight, and I couldn't help but swallow. This man is Alaric. We met in a cooking class. At that time, my mom mentioned that Thaddeus had high standards when it came to food, so she encouraged me to learn more about different cuisines. Unfortunately, I've always struggled with that. Alaric and I are in the same group, and he's been a big help to me. But apart from class, we don't even have each other's contact info. Running into him now really feels like fate. "Is everything okay?" His voice was dropped low, making it stand out in the noisy surroundings. I shook my head, and Ophelia's words echoed in my mind. For some reason, I suddenly felt a surge of courage. I grabbed his collar, my hands trembling, and slowly unbuttoned the first button. Alaric looked down, his eyelashes like crow feathers, his eyes pitch black. It wasn't until I got closer that I noticed a small red mole at the corner of his eye, which was quite captivating. In the dim light, everything seemed even more enchanting. Serafina, a common name, yet it felt uniquely captivating. Our breaths intertwined. I tried hard to resist the urge to kiss. I didn't expect him to suddenly hook my head with one hand, twist me around, and slam me against the wall. But it didn't hurt at all. Alaric's breathing got heavier, and I couldn't hold back. I went in for the kiss. In an instant, his breath became a bit frantic. The memories that followed became hazy. When I woke up again, I found myself lying on the bed. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a winding river flowed through tall buildings. The door was open, and the scent of rice wafted in. I slipped on some slippers and got out of bed. Alaric was sitting there without a shirt, and his body was marred with obvious scratches. I couldn't help but gasp. Just as I was about to say something, Alaric laughed first. "Awake? Go brush your teeth and wash your face. It's time for breakfast." The tone is so familiar, it feels like this is just an everyday routine. I quiet down and notice a fresh set of toiletries in the bathroom, clearly tailored for a man. I can't help but glance around. Everything has a simple black and white design, exactly like the owner's vibe. The toothpaste was bubbling in my mouth, but my mind just wouldn't stop racing. Normally, these things between guys and girls are pretty normal. So why was I so anxious? I procrastinated for a bit, then finally made my way over to the dining table. Breakfast is ready. The rice porridge is steaming in the sunlight. I tried calling his name, but Alaric immediately interrupted me. "Serafina, let's get married." "Huh? Since we're talking about a marriage alliance, why not choose me?" After Alaric said that, Grandma from the Davenport group showed up at our door that very evening with gifts. My parents were shocked and privately asked me when I had become involved with Alaric. The Davenport group is a wealthy family. Their main business is overseas, but they have significant influence domestically as well. Alaric's grandma casually picked up a jade bracelet worth millions, and my mom was over the moon. I was in the backyard with Alaric, and he noticed that I wasn't really myself. Honestly, I wasn't in a rush for anything too fast. He came right up to me and gradually knelt down on one knee. I'd already missed one chance before, and today I brought my grandma along because I wanted you to see that when choosing a partner, could you maybe think about me too? He looked up at me, the streetlight glowing in his eyes like a multitude of stars. Suddenly, a flood of memories rushed back. It seemed I had signed up for the cooking class first, and then Alaric decided to join. The teacher asked if we wanted to team up, but it was actually Alaric who approached me. He tentatively asked for my contact info, but I turned him down because of Thaddeus. Seeing the disappointment in his eyes felt so real. A few times it rained and he didn't bring an umbrella. He chose to walk me home, no questions asked. He understood that I wasn't big on conversation, so he kept his distance. Yet, the moment I turned around, there he was, right by my side. He moved carefully, always within the space where I felt safe. He kept this distance for a long time. Alaric and I got married in a flash. He wasn't wrong. Since I decided to go for an arranged marriage, why not choose someone I've already known for 2 years? He never missed a baking class, which we took together every week. With this kind of determination, success is inevitable. More importantly, we've torn up that piece of paper. For me, getting married just makes sense. So when I showed Ophelia the 10-carat diamond ring, she was so shocked that her jaw dropped for 5 minutes. 10 carats? 10 carats! She held my hand and looked closely, showering me with compliments. I knew Alaric was wealthy, but I never expected him to be this rich. I felt a bit embarrassed. He said he wanted to customize an engagement ring based on my birth month and would give me a new one at the wedding. I glanced around and then wrote a number in the palm of Ophelia's hand. 16 carats? Ophelia suddenly had a thought. Wait, is he adding up your months together? I nodded, feeling a rush of sweetness inside. Ophelia teased, I've been saying all along that there are so many wonderful things out there, but you just can't see them. She pointed towards the terrace as she spoke. I followed her gaze and saw Thaddeus and Calliope. They noticed us too, and Thaddeus walked straight over. Calliope was biting her lip, looking quite reluctant. But in the end, she had no choice but to come along. Where have you been? Thaddeus clearly wasn't happy. His tone was a bit irritable. He just plopped down right in front of me, not even caring about how I felt. At that moment, I suddenly missed Alaric a lot. He never questioned me or looked at me with such a cold stare. Even the way of speaking was gentle, as if there wasn't an ounce of irritation. Thaddeus noticed my silence and surprisingly softened his demeanor a bit. How have you been thinking about this month? If you regret breaking off the engagement, I can bring it up with my family. Ophelia let out a cold huff from the side. That's so funny, Thaddeus. People really need to look ahead. Leaning on my arm, she had a playful look in her eyes. Are you saying you're interested in our Serafina? Thaddeus held back his feelings and stubbornly shot back. Still, the anxiety in his eyes didn't fade. Stop talking nonsense. I just feel that Serafina waited for me for so long, and backing out of the engagement isn't fair to her as a girl. Thaddeus! Calliope interrupted him. Her eyes were red, clearly holding back her emotions. What do you mean by that? Do you want to change your mind? Thaddeus paused for a moment, looking a bit puzzled. He stared at the ring on my hand, which was shining in the light. Without saying much, Thaddeus reached out and took my hand. What is this? I instinctively struggled and coldly replied, the ring. Thaddeus stared at me, his voice shaking. What ring? Ophelia stepped in front of me, clearly irritated. What other ring could it be? It's obviously an engagement ring. No, Thaddeus never proposed, so of course he wouldn't know. The calm look on his face shattered in an instant. From the moment we announced our engagement to when we got engaged, I was the one orchestrating everything. The Whitlock family says they value me, but the ring they offered was pretty ordinary. They want Thaddeus to hold a proposal ceremony for me, but Thaddeus just handed me the ring and said, love it or leave it. That was his proposal. At that time, I thought I loved him, so I put up with all his bad moods. The truth is, I was held back by what my elders said. Thaddeus was smarter. He had already stepped out of that circle long before I could. It was Alaric who took me out. In the end, Thaddeus had no choice but to leave in embarrassment. Calliope, hearing our conversation, raised an eyebrow slightly, showing her disdain. She knew I was no longer her rival. There was no way anything could develop between Thaddeus and me. She really didn't need to pay attention to me anymore. Before she could leave, I called out to her. I asked the servant to get me a piece of paper and write down the contacts from my phone one by one. What is this? Calliope looked annoyed, her face darkening. She seemed to realize something, her lips turning pale. Ophelia stood nearby, secretly thrilled. Ever since my engagement to him, those girls had been coming at me one after another. I thought for a moment and tried to soften my tone. Some of them might not be genuine. You can cross-reference the timeline. When Thaddeus is with you, he must be really busy. Calliope wants to ruin my engagement to Thaddeus, but she's not the first one to try, and she won't be the last. Thaddeus's personality won't change no matter who he marries. If Calliope could actually marry Thaddeus, getting to know each other in advance would be good for her. Being able to let things go is important. If she can't fit into the Whitlock family, then that's a way to escape a tricky situation. Calliope stared at the paper I handed her, staying quiet for quite a while. The hostility on her face faded a bit, and in the end, she took it. But her hands were shaking a lot. Ophelia asked me why I told Calliope. She wanted to see the drama unfold. I finished the last sip of my juice and smiled. If Calliope and Thaddeus actually got married, wouldn't that give us endless entertainment? Ophelia thought for a moment, then smiled and took my hand, leading me away. We made plans to check out wedding dresses, so there was no time to waste. By the time I finished everything and got home, it was already 10 at night. I don't stay at Alaric's. I have my own little house now. It's not huge, but it feels cozy to live in. Every day when I get home, at least the stuff inside is mine. I didn't expect to see Thaddeus waiting for me right outside my building after just a few steps. I couldn't help but take a couple of steps back. What are you doing here? I didn't ask how he found me. After all, the circle is so small that you can learn a lot just by asking around. It was clear that Thaddeus had been waiting for a while. When he smiled at me, he looked really tired. They said I'm getting married. I frowned, not understanding why he suddenly mentioned that. I thought you bought this ring yourself. But just a month later, you're actually getting married. He looked at me with a hint of sadness in his voice. Serafina, haven't you always liked me? I waited for you for so long. How could you suddenly fall for someone else? It turned out he knew I had been waiting for him all those years. He knew I had feelings for him, but it didn't seem to matter to him. For him, there are many people who like him. I'm just one of them, and I'm the first love. Because of this role, he feels restricted. After knowing each other for so many years, how could I not understand his thoughts? I stood there and calmly asked, so what about you? Thaddeus, we've known each other for over 20 years. From the time we got engaged to when you returned from studying abroad, did you ever have a moment where you wanted to take responsibility for me? Thaddeus instinctively tried to explain, but I cut him off. No, you just enjoy the way I make you feel. I shook my head. You know that no matter how outrageous you act, I'll always be here waiting for you. I won't complain or hold a grudge. But I'm human too, and I have my own emotions and feelings. I'm not without self-respect, Thaddeus. Finally, he began to panic, his hands trembling as he tried to find the right words. Guilt washed over Thaddeus. He realized he couldn't explain himself at all. Serafina seemed calm, but her words were always blunt, making it feel like there was nowhere to hide from everything about himself in front of her. He was really scared, so he decided to run away. But how could feelings just disappear because of distance? Especially abroad, his longing for Serafina spread like vines, eventually wrapping around him like a spider's web. Still, he was a man. It was his choice to go overseas. If he went back now with his tail between his legs, Serafina would catch him and never let him forget it. This made it even harder to save face. So, Thaddeus started seeking out pleasure more often. He attended parties and accepted the women his friends sent his way. During that time, he found himself waking up in a strange bed almost every day. But it didn't make any difference. He still missed Serafina like crazy. Then Calliope came into the picture. She was lively and enthusiastic, always dragging him into new adventures every day. Slowly, he started to forget Serafina. The ever-dutiful Serafina finally decided to give Calliope a title and even took her back home. He thought this would help him deal with the pressure at home. However, when everyone found out about the broken engagement, he felt even worse. Calliope couldn't do anything. She couldn't comfort him. After holding it in for a month, he learned that Serafina was getting married. Thaddeus couldn't take it anymore, so he decided to come and get some answers. He couldn't believe that Serafina would actually want to marry someone else. Thaddeus's expression shifted wildly. I didn't want to waste any more time, so I told him to leave. It's getting late. Calliope must be waiting for you. Thaddeus's eyes immediately reddened. His dark eyes lost their usual coldness, and his face was filled with a mix of unwillingness and frustration. It seemed like he was about to say something, but then Alaric stepped out. He was in his loungewear, wearing the indoor slippers I had bought for him. Why is he out so late? I frowned and walked over. It's pretty cold outside. Isn't he worried about catching a chill? Alaric smiled and casually took my bag from me. I noticed you hadn't come back for a while, and I started to worry a bit. I felt this warm feeling inside, and I couldn't help but smile. Ever since being with Alaric, it seems like I've been smiling more and more. I grin whenever I get his messages right on time, and I can't help but smile when he shares his plans with me. Watching him busy in the kitchen made me laugh out loud. Alaric's warm hands pulled me into his embrace. It was as if he was signaling to Thaddeus that I belonged to him. Honestly, it wasn't even necessary. After breaking off the engagement with Thaddeus, there was nothing left between us. Alaric looked Thaddeus up and down with a casual attitude. Thaddeus, it's been a while. Thaddeus's expression darkened as he let out a cold laugh, ignoring him completely. Then he turned to me and said, Serafina, I'll come find you tomorrow. With that, he turned to leave. Alaric jumped in, saying, Thaddeus, there's no need for that. We're about to go on our honeymoon, and Serafina will soon be moving into our new home. Thaddeus came to a stop, his figure showing a hint of loneliness. After all, those words were supposed to come from him. When we got back, Alaric rested his chin on my shoulder, looking like a sad puppy. After spending some time together, I got to know his personality. This was just how he acted when he was feeling down. He wanted me to comfort him. Do you still have feelings for him? I replied helplessly. What do you think? Alaric leaned in closer, his lips resting in the crook of my neck, and it felt oddly tingly. I couldn't help it. I pushed him away a little. You're not allowed to like me. He's actually sticking to his guns this time. I ran my fingers through his hair and cradled his face, nodding as I said, okay, I like you. Alaric smiled and nodded back, but then he froze. He looked at me, half skeptical, and asked, what did you just say? I kissed his lips, my tone firm. I like you. From now on, I'll only like Alaric. A bright joy flashed in Alaric's eyes, and he seemed a bit flustered. After a moment, he gently touched his forehead to my nose. Then, he started to cry. Seeing this, I couldn't help but laugh and kissed him, wrapping my arms around his neck. I realized that over the past month, Alaric had really opened up to me. He shared a lot about what he likes and his little quirks. He was also glad that I could fit into his life. This time, I decided to give it a shot. The wedding preparations quickly started to take shape. To find the perfect diamond, Alaric was constantly traveling between several mines he owned. He even called on his connections and relatives overseas for help. News of this spread rapidly through our circle. Everyone was surprised by how much Alaric cared about me, and many expressed envy at how I had found such a great match. One day, a package arrived for me. When I opened it, I found a stunning, high-quality loose diamond. I didn't bother to dig into where the diamond came from, I simply gave it to Ophelia. She quickly found a designer and started wearing it. This really boosted her status, and she felt quite pleased with herself. Recently, she's been really caught up with wedding planning, and it's been a bit overwhelming. During this time, we also started talking about Thaddeus. She mentioned that Thaddeus broke up with Calliope. She even slipped away to another country, and I heard she found a wealthy boyfriend there who's 50 years old, and her parents set them up. The rich guy can only support her from a distance, he can't marry her. One time, Ophelia ran into Calliope while she was buying a bag at the store, and it was quite a shock. Calliope didn't mind being in a relationship, but she couldn't handle the idea of Thaddeus seeing other women on the side. Seeing that list of names really broke her for a while. It was hard to accept that while Thaddeus was with her, he was also reaching out to others. Even when she thought she had pushed me away during that rough patch, Thaddeus still had a dozen or so contacts saved on his phone. After that, Thaddeus grew distant with her. He couldn't even coax her a little. He accepted his family's arrangement and chose to go through with the marriage alliance. After all the ups and downs, he ended up taking this path. However, the Whitlock family didn't hold a wedding. The reason was that the person Thaddeus chose was a recent college graduate, and she ended up getting pregnant. The Whitlock family felt it was undignified, so they only got a marriage certificate. The woman had no background, so she could only suffer in silence. Ophelia sighed, grateful that you didn't marry him, otherwise, you'd face a lot of unfairness. I just smiled and kept looking at wedding dress styles. Thaddeus has always been like this. He never wants to compromise. No matter how much time has passed, some just can't learn to respect others. The models walked out one by one from behind the curtain, wearing the styles I picked. At that moment, my phone buzzed with a message, "I'll wait for you at the store entrance in an hour." I didn't want Alaric to see the styles before the big reveal, so I asked him not to join me for the wedding dress fitting. He obediently played the role of a driver. I replied with a quick sure. Ophelia was asking for my thoughts. I couldn't help but smile at her elaborate white dress. There are many days ahead, and I plan to live them well.